if you're going to use acid, keep it in a proper well-marked container with a lid on, and always use gloves and safety goggles when you open these containers, and always add the acid to the water. You can use safety pickles. Here is alum powder, which you can get still from chemists, in a slow cooker with water, and that's good for hollow repairs, hollow chains and hollow bangles where you can't use acid. I'm using these visors with a magnification on the side there. Now you have a choice of either using powder flux. This is easy flux here. Flux is used to stop oxidization where you're trying to solder. So it allows this solder to flow. I've put a little bit of water in a small container using a small file, and I'm looking for a creamy consistency. And I can apply that to the joint and apply my solder to that, and with your tweezers you can just control the solder where it's going. If you want to use borax, this dish with the borax cone is mixed with a little bit of water, a nice creamy consistency again. You can see an M on the side of the dish there, which denotes medium, so you can have 2 or 3 dishes with different types of silver solder. And I'm just going to snip off a few small pieces of solder into the dish. I've got my finger over the end again, and that stops the little bits flying off, and using some little snips there, giving myself enough solder, dropping it into that creamy borax there. You'll notice I've flattened the silver solder either on the rolling mill or with a hammer. Make it nice and flat, easier to cut and use less borax. Little paintbrush there, and I can just pick up a little bit of solder and I can apply that to my area. I've put a little rub over setting, rectangular setting, onto an old piece of silver sheet there, tied it down with a piece of tying wire, and I'm going to apply little bits of silver solder with borax on them around this little setting, using the brush there, just picking little bits up. You see a little bit on the end there, and I'm going to put, you don't need too much, but just, you'll get used to working out how much solder you need, but you can see how much I've put on this little job. Now I'm going to apply some heat, and on the whole area, and just put that little bit back on there. They do jump off sometimes and jump all over the place. This is where you need just to be a little bit patient to make sure that all your solder is exactly where you want it to go, and you will see it if you watch carefully. You will see that little bit of solder on this side. Just bring it a bit closer. You watch it and you'll see it run, and it's run all the way around that gap, and now I've soldered that little setting to that bit of scrap sheet there. Careful, it's very hot. And there we have it. So now don't put steel wire in acid, because it'll make it go, make everything else you put in the acid have an oxidized tint to it. Just going to cut off the excess now and just leave a little rub over setting on a little backing there, and keep all these little bits of scrap. You can melt them down now what I want to do is just take the excess, just file that base there into the same shape as the rub over all the way around. And if I'm going to set a stone into this rub over, I want to just file the top of it to make it a bit thinner so it'll be easier to push over. But in this occasion I'm just going to put a little bit of cold enamel in there with different colours in it, so that's going to look quite pretty. So again, on our bench, holding it firm down to the bench, filing, using the file both ways, not just pushing forward like that. We can, that's it, using the maximum amount of energy there and the whole of the file. We're not taking off too much all at once, we're just doing this little by little, taking all the excess down to the rub over, and then as normal we will buff that later and get it looking nice before we decide to set our stone. The more work you do now, the less there is to do with when the stone is actually in there. And what I'll probably do now is I'll put a little jump ring on top with a little bail on that and a nice little pendant. So with our piercing saw and our, depending on which blade you use, this one's quite thin, I think it's either a 4 or a 6. You want to just put it in one end, a little bit of tension with your chest against a peg, give it a ping there, make sure it's really in there. And now we're going to solder this hollow chain, and when we put the flux on and we put a bit of solder on, we'll be careful to stop in time, because with hollow chains the solder will get sucked up into the hollow part, so you can use quite a lot of solder. So I'm just going to, you'll see it just start to go, and I'll just stop, that's it. And the glass brush I can use for getting rid of oxidization on hollow chains and gets in all the nooks and crannies prior to polishing. Just prior to polishing, and just remind you not to put hollow chains and bangles in acid. Always use a safety pickle, because it will stay in there and it's a devil to get out. Using this French torch, you blow in one tube and the other tube you see is attached to a propane gas bottle on a low pressure valve. Make sure you follow all the manufacturer's requirements for fitting these. They're very easy to control. You've got a wheel there which controls the flame, and as you blow in you can intensify the flame and you can get a real pin sharp flame there for very tiny soldering. And with a bit of practice you will find this a very reasonably priced and effective tool. Making sure that my soldering block is nice and flat and level, and checking that there are nothing hanging around that can catch fire, like curtains or towels or any flammable material. My rolling mill there, my wedding ring stretcher, an ultrasonic cleaner there, very useful for before and after polishing, and a homemade polishing motor. Well, the case is just an ordinary motor there with spindles on it and my mops either end. Electroplating machine for gold, silver and rhodium plating. And then most used tool is a pendant motor. These are very reasonable now, and they come with a range of attachments I keep a small selection of tools right next to me on the bench, everything I need. It's very neat and very handy. Got all my pliers, my snips, round nose, flat pliers, my peg, and all these little tins that I keep different metals and solders and bits and pieces in there. My soldering area where I can prop up bits that I'm soldering. That's where I keep the oxyacetylene, which I use for hard solders or platinum, and I have a poise lamp, angle poise lamp, that can focus the light where I want it. Soda crystals right next to the acid, soda crystals and water which neutralizes the acid. Got some little cabinets and drawers there to keep little bits and pieces in, and it's important to have good ventilation if you're using ammonia or some of the plating fluids. First thing we'll look at is a simple ring sizing. Now I believe this is a CZ ring, but never guess. Always make sure that you know what the stone is, and if you don't, treat it with respect. I'm checking the shank there to see where I can cut. I don't want to cut through the hole mark if possible. Making sure my blade is nice and tense, and I'm really holding it now. I'm going to hold the ring down on the peg very, very firmly, because sometimes if it snatches it can bend the shank. So I'm holding both sides of that shank firmly down in the corner of that peg there, and I'm going to try and, I don't want the blade to jump all over that ring, so I'm going to do one cut very firmly, and then I'm going to cut the piece out the other side there. A size is usually a thickness of the shank, so if it's two sizes, it's two thicknesses of the shank. I keep the little bits and pieces separately. If it's 9 karat gold, it goes in the 9 karat gold tin. And now very carefully I want to close that gap up. I'm going to use a pair of old round nose pliers, no sharp edges that cut into the shank, and I'm not going to grip it too hard. I just want to very gently close that gap up, and I'll do it first by, I'll slightly overlap the other side of the shank there, and then I shall try to get the other side so there's a very, very nice tight join there. We don't need a gap, we want it to be very tight, we want it to be aligned, because once that's soldered we don't want it to be stepped or offset. We want it to be absolutely perfectly joined to the other side of the shank. So we need some 9 karat solder. There's a pally in there of 9 karat, and we're just going to snip a little piece off, holding your finger over the end of the pallion. First cut down one way and then cut across, and this will ping off if you haven't got your finger covering it. So there's a couple of bits there. That's the bit I'm going to use with my tweezers. Try and get hold of this piece. Nice pointed tweezers there. Get hold of it flat ways there, and then I'm going to use the corner of my peg with my left hand just to pull open that a little bit and just slide a little bit of solder in there. And that's what it should look like there. You don't need too much solder, just enough just to cover it. Now this is a different ring, but same principle again, except this time we're going to put a piece in. This ring has to go up. So before I show you the soldering technique, let's just show you the technique in adding a piece in. So again, nice and tight down on the bench, nice clean square cut, and to see what the size is going to be, put it on our ring sizer there, and we're just going to push it slightly, making sure I'm checking the shoulders of the ring to make sure I'm not doing any damage as I'm pushing that ring up the ring sizer. I'm looking it carefully, I'm checking everything, and it looks like that's the gap that has to be filled to obtain our size. I'll just push it past the size it needs, then as it comes back it'll spring back a little bit. So I've got in my mind now what sizes. Now there's my piece of 9-carat material. I'm going to make sure it's slightly wider than needed. I can file it back to the size of the shank, so I'm just checking there the size of the piece that I'm cutting off. And that's my little bit of 9-carat. It's got to go in the shank there. I've got it in there. Now, because I don't know what the stone is, and I'm afraid that there's going to be too much heat travelling down the shank, I've used a doming block there, a little bit of water in it, and I've submerged the stone in the water, clamped it there with my tweezers, and this is to prevent any heat going to the stone. Now I'm going to put a little bit of flux where I need it to be soldered, remembering this is the piece that's going in, but it would be exactly the same technique if we were reducing the ring. So what I need to do now is try to pick up a piece of solder and place it over the gap there, and you'll see it very quickly. I've used easy solder there. Very quickly the solders ran, and that's a success. So we've got our little piece in there, and all we need to do now is to make sure we can pick that up. The heat will dissipate very quickly if you just put a little bit on the shank. I've got a number 4 file. Now I'm going to hold this and I'm going to file the piece that I've put in. I really in no way do I want to touch the existing ring. I don't want to file any gold away, so although it looks like I'm filing away there happily. The file is just touching the piece that I've put in, and you see where I've made the piece that's gone in a little bit thicker, so I can file it down to meet the size of the existing shank. I'm also keeping the file very flat. I'm not keeping it up on edge because that will cut into the existing shank, and making sure that it's dead flat on that inserted piece there. I just want to feather it down, and then the outside of the shank again, and a round motion. We don't want facets on the shank, flat areas. It's all going to be round movements, going with the flow, with the shape of the shank. We're shaping that piece in to the existing shape of the shank. This may take a while, but it's worth really taking your time here to get this right, because this is where the best result will come from, taking a little bit of time. Now I can now check my size. I'm looking down that end to see whether it's round. It seems to be a little bit of an egg shape there, so I think what I'll do is I'll put it in on my triblet, and with my hide hammer, so as not to mark the shank, we'll just make that a little bit rounder, and then we can check our size again. Now that's better, that's nice and round, as you can see there. And the size, yep, that's it. That's spot on. I've got a bit of dowel there with some emery paper, and there's different grades of emery paper. I believe it's 1F that you could obtain from most suppliers, and if you use different grades you can get a very smooth finish. And we've got a flat piece of wood there, and it's covered again with emery paper, and again I'm keeping it very flat to the ring. I don't want to cut in or file away the existing shank. All I'm trying to do is blend that piece that I've put in into the shank. And we can buff and buff and buff until we've removed the file marks and the previous emery paper marks, until we've got no marks left at all. I'm avoiding filing over the stone because I don't know what the stone is. If you buff over the top of the stone you can actually scratch the stone, so be careful with that. And also not to hit any claws, because you can file the claws down as well if there are any. And looks like that's job done. Now here I'm going to make a ring that's a customer's order out of a piece of sheet silver there. First thing I want to do is to get the width of the ring. I'm going to use a pair of scribes, dividers, call them what you will, and that's going to be the width of the ring. Now I need the length of the ring. The way to do this is get your ring sizer, get a bit of wire and twist it around where the size of the ring must be, and once that's done get some There we go, let's just make sure that's the correct size there. And what we want to do now is get some snips and just cut that, and then if you open it out, there's a bit of just cutting the excess off there, just cut inside that circle, and that will be the length that you need to cut. So I'm just going to mark it there, just a guess, doesn't have to be exact, but just make sure you've got a little bit of excess to play with always. So that's the dimensions of my ring, the length and the width. Now we're going to cut this out using my piercing saw. I've got probably a number 2 blade on the piercing saw there, and as they get finer they go up to 4 and 6 and so on, and they get very fine. But this is quite a thick piece of silver here. I've put a bit of beeswax on the blade there, which is going to stop the friction on the blade as I'm cutting this big piece of silver, making sure that's all nice and tight. Now I've cut the piece of silver that I want. I'm holding it there with some pliers, and I'm filing. I just want to get a straight edge, one straight edge, and the reason I'm holding it with those pliers is because it gets very, very hot, the silver, when you're filing. So when you get one straight edge, you can use the dividers again to run along and get the other edge straight. A rolling mill here. I'm just going to flatten this silver out a bit because it's a bit too short for the job. So to make it longer, I'm going to use my rolling mill, and that will stretch my silver out to the desired length. Now, this customer wanted Roman numerals stamped into the ring, which I believe was a date of birth in Roman numerals, XV11. I'm marking out where the letters are going to be stamped. So I'm putting them about 10 mil apart, making little boxes there on the ring so I can stamp the letters into those little boxes and get them a nice uniform ring.